The Pennsylvania fog was a living thing, a thick, damp shroud that clung to the hemlocks and ancient oaks of the Allegheny National Forest. It wasn't rain, but the breath of the mountains, blanketing the world in a silent, gray embrace that was a perfect mirror for Cade Callahan's soul. From the porch of his rented cabin, Pittsburgh was a theoretical glow in the distance, a world he had surgically removed himself from. This small, isolated box of timber and glass, tucked deep in the woods, was his chosen purgatory. Cade Callahan was a man made of whipcord muscle and hard lines, hammered into shape by the unforgiving forge of the Navy SEALs. At 6 feet 2 inches, with a shaved head and eyes the color of slate, he moved with a fluid lethality that was both quiet and absolute. Even here, surrounded by the deep silence of the forest, his body was a weapon at a low, constant hum of readiness. Morning started before the sun with a brutal regimen of pull-ups and push-ups on the porch railing, the humid air doing nothing to quench the fire of memory that smoldered behind his eyes. He'd come to these mountains to escape the ghosts of a dusty, foreign war, but the ghosts had traveled with him. The silence he had sought now felt like a vault, amplifying the one voice he'd come to escape, his own, endlessly replaying the mission, the mistake, the final, fatal moment that had cost him his brother in arms. He was stirring a packet of instant coffee into a steaming mug when the silence fractured. It wasn't a loud noise, just a rustle in the dense underbrush past the edge of the clearing, followed by a low, pained whine that was quickly choked off. Cade went still. In an instant, his posture shifted, his senses flaring. Every nerve, honed by years of stepping into the unknown, screamed that something was wrong. His eyes swept the tree line, dissecting the shadows, noting every branch that swayed unnaturally. The woods were full of life, white-tailed deer, coyotes, the occasional black bear. But that sound was different. It carried a note of manufactured pain, a sound that violated the natural order of the forest. He placed his mug on the railing without a sound and moved to the heavy plank door, pulling on his worn leather boots. He took the Sig Sauer P226 from the mantel, its cold, familiar weight a grim reassurance in his hand. The slide was already racked. It was always ready. Stepping onto the porch, he let the fog settle on his face, his breathing controlled, his eyes scanning. The whine came again, nearer this time, a sound of profound suffering coming from the base of a massive oak tree bordering his property. He moved off the porch, his steps silent on the damp soil. As he rounded the cabin, he saw it. Lying half concealed in a patch of ferns was a German shepherd. The dog was a magnificent animal, with a classic black and tan coat and proud bearing of its breed, but it was in terrible shape. Its fur was matted with burrs, mud, and blood. One of its hind legs was bent at a sickening angle, and deep, ragged tears ran along its flank, as if it had clawed its way through barbed wire, or something far worse. But it was the wound on its shoulder that made Cade's breath catch. It was a neat, dark hole, weeping blood, a gunshot wound, small caliber, but fresh. The dog, which Cade would later name Ranger, was a large male, powerfully built, now laid low by his injuries. His eyes, the color of dark amber, were locked on Cade. They held not the panicked fear of a stray, but a focused, desperate intelligence. He didn't growl or show his teeth. He watched, assessed, and communicated. Slowly, keeping his movements smooth and non-threatening, Cade holstered his weapon. He held out his empty hands, palms up. "Easy, buddy," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. "I'm not gonna hurt you." The dog's breathing was shallow and fast. It tried to push itself up on its forelegs, but a spasm of pain racked its body and it collapsed with another muffled whimper. Despite the agony, its gaze never wavered from Cade. There was an urgency in those eyes, a plea that went beyond a simple need for aid. Cade approached cautiously, kneeling a few feet away. "Someone really did a number on you," he said. He could see more now. The dog wore a heavy-duty nylon tactical collar, not something you'd find at a pet store. It had a metal clasp and a reinforced D-ring. This wasn't a lost family pet. This was a professional. As Cade moved closer, the dog did something that defied all instinct. With a surge of effort, it dragged itself forward, ignoring the fire that must have been coursing through its body. It didn't snap or bite. Instead, it reached out and gently, deliberately, took the cuff of Cade's flannel shirt between its teeth. The pressure was firm, not aggressive. It was a clear, unmistakable command. "Come." The dog tugged weakly, its amber eyes locked on his. Then it let go and lifted its head, gesturing with its muzzle toward the dense, dark woods it had emerged from. Cade stared, his mind racing. This was not the behavior of an ordinary animal. This was training. The control, the clear communication, the focus through extreme pain. He'd seen it before. He'd worked with dogs like this. K9s. Military working dogs. They were soldiers, just like him. "Where do you want me to go, boy?" Cade asked softly. The German Shepherd gave another soft pull on his sleeve, then whined again, a sound of raw frustration, as if trying to tell him they were losing time. It looked back at the forest, then at Cade, its intent as clear as a spoken order. A war raged inside Cade. He had come here for solitude, to build a fortress around himself and let the world die away. This dog was a piece of that world, a world of violence, duty, and blood, bleeding on his doorstep and demanding something of him. His first instinct was to say no, to patch the dog up and send it on its way, to retreat back into the sterile safety of his isolation. But as he looked into those intelligent, pleading eyes, he saw a mirror of himself. A fellow soldier, wounded and alone, trying to complete the mission. And he saw the ghost of Ryan, his fallen teammate, whose final look had been one of complete trust. Trust Cade had failed. He couldn't fail this one, too. "All right," Cade said, the decision made. "All right, I get it. But we're not going anywhere until I fix this hole in you. You're no good to anyone bleeding out in my yard." He moved with purpose now. The dog seemed to understand, lying still as Cade gently examined the wound. The bullet had passed clean through the muscle, a miracle of millimeters sparing anything vital. It had to be cleaned and dressed now. "Stay," Cade commanded, his voice firm and low. The dog laid its head on its paws, its eyes tracking him. Cade went back inside, returning with the field trauma kit he always kept ready. He worked with practiced efficiency, cleaning the wound with antiseptic, his touch sure and gentle. The dog endured the sting without a single flinch, its discipline absolute. This confirmed everything. This was a highly trained operator. As he wrapped a pressure bandage around the dog's shoulder, he looked more closely at the collar. Tucked into a small, nearly invisible flap on the inner lining, his fingers found it, a tiny, waterproof memory card. His blood ran cold. This was no longer just a wounded dog. This was a messenger. And whatever was on that card was important enough to get shot over. He finished splinting the mangled leg as best he could. The dog licked his hand once, a brief acknowledgement, before struggling to its feet, unsteady but resolute. It looked at Cade, took a single limping step toward the trees, and waited. The mission had come to him. Cade stood, wiping the dog's blood from his hands. He went back inside, grabbing a rain jacket, his pistol, 2 spare magazines, and a combat knife. He pocketed the memory card. The quiet cabin, his sanctuary of guilt, now felt like a fragile illusion. The real world, with all its sharp and bloody edges, had found him. He took one last look at the cold coffee in his mug, then stepped out into the fog, a ghost leaving one tomb to follow a messenger to another. The forest swallowed them whole. One moment they were in the small clearing of the cabin, a tiny island of civilization, and the next they were submerged in a world of deep green and shifting gray. The fog had thickened, muffling all sound and reducing visibility to a few dozen feet, each drop of moisture clinging to the broad leaves of the forest floor. Cade moved with a practiced silence, his boots finding purchase on slick moss and damp earth as if by second nature. Ahead, the German Shepherd, Ranger, the name felt right, limped onward with a relentless, grim resolve. The dog did not wander. Its path was direct. It navigated the dense undergrowth not like an animal searching for a trail, but like a guide following an invisible map burned into its memory. It would pause, its head high to test the air, its ears swiveling to catch sounds Cade couldn't perceive, before continuing on its unwavering course. Cade was a follower, a role that chafed at his very core. Seals led, they improvised, they overcame. They were not led by a wounded dog into an unknown situation. And yet, he followed. The weight of the tiny memory card in his pocket was a constant, heavy reminder that this was no ordinary trek. An hour bled into 2. The terrain grew rougher, descending into a hollow thick with fallen trees and tangled rhododendron. Ranger moved through it all with a painful purpose, his bandaged shoulder a stark white patch against his dark fur. The animal's endurance was astounding, a testament to its conditioning and the urgency of its purpose. It was as they crossed a shallow, rock-strewn creek that Cade's internal alarms began to sound. Halfway across, his gaze, which never stopped sweeping his surroundings, caught on something out of place. On the far bank, nestled among the rounded river stones, was one with a fresh, sharp edge. A small chip of shale, recently broken. Above it, pressed deep into the soft mud, was a single, heavy boot print, partially obscured by the dampness but undeniably there. It was fresh. No more than a few hours old. He froze midstream, the cold water seeping into his boots. Ranger, sensing the change, looked back, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Cade raised a hand, a silent command for quiet. The dog obeyed instantly. Someone was on their trail, or, more likely, had been on Ranger's trail. The realization settled over him not with fear, but with a cold, familiar clarity. This wasn't just a mission to deliver a message. It was an evasion. Ranger wasn't just a messenger. He was a fugitive. And now, so was Cade. He scanned the trees again, his eyes searching for the unnatural line of a rifle barrel, the silhouette of a man. He saw nothing, but that meant nothing. The best hunters were the ones you never saw. He crossed the rest of the creek, quickly moving them into the cover of a dense stand of pines. They were exposed. He needed to know what he was walking into. "Hold up, boy," he whispered, placing a steadying hand on Ranger's back. The dog leaned into his touch, its body trembling from exhaustion. "Just a minute." While Ranger drank from a puddle, Cade knelt and turned his full attention to the tactical collar. In his haste at the cabin, he had only searched for the card. Now, in the deep woods, he examined it properly. It was military grade. As he ran his fingers over the thick nylon, he felt a small, hard object sewn into the lining, hidden behind the main buckle. Not a tracker. Too small, too inert. It felt like a patch. With careful fingers, he worked the object free. It was a small, circular patch made of subdued, rubberized material. The design was stark, a stylized Spartan helmet, bisected by a single, jagged lightning bolt. The breath caught in Cade's throat. The world around him, the dripping pines and gray fog, dissolved, replaced by the blinding sun and choking dust of a foreign valley. He was no longer kneeling in the damp Pennsylvania soil. He was crouched behind the rubble of a bombed-out building, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood. "Watch your six, Cade. They're pushing our flank." The voice was Ryan's, clear as if he were standing right next to him. Rye Fletcher, his swim buddy, his brother. A man with a quick laugh and an unshakable sense of loyalty. On Rye's helmet, fixed to the Velcro, had been that same insignia. Task Force Aegis, a ghost unit spun up for a single, high-stakes operation. A unit that was officially disavowed, its record sealed, after the mission went sideways. The memory hit him like a physical blow. The sudden ambush, the chaos over the comms, his last sight of Rye providing cover fire as Cade and the others fell back to the extraction point. His movements were precise, controlled, even as the enemy closed in. Cade had followed orders. The chopper couldn't wait. He had left his brother. They told him Rye was gone, consumed in the firefight. His body was never recovered. And for 7 years, Cade had carried that failure, a piece of shrapnel buried deep in his soul. A wet nose nudged his hand, pulling him back from the past. Ranger was looking at him, his amber eyes filled with a strange, knowing sadness. The dog whined softly, as if it could feel his pain. Cade stared at the Aegis patch, then back at the dog. It all slammed into place. The pieces of a puzzle he never knew existed. This dog, Rye's unit, the memory card. This wasn't a random encounter. This was a message from beyond the grave. Rye hadn't just died. He had been trying to get a message out. And this dog, this brave, wounded soldier, was his last communication. The guilt he had tried to bury in these mountains came roaring back, but this time it was different. It wasn't the passive, corrosive thing it had been. It was sharp, focused. It was a purpose. "He sent you," Cade whispered, his voice thick with emotion as he stroked Ranger's head. "Rye sent you to find me." Ranger licked his hand, gave a soft, low bark, and turned, ready to move again. The trail ahead was no longer an unknown. It was a duty. It was the path to an answer he had long ago given up on. He stood, his body infused with a new resolve. The hunter in the woods behind them was no longer just a threat. He was an enemy. He was no longer just Cade Callahan, the broken seal hiding from his past. He was an operator for Task Force Aegis again, and he had one last mission to complete for his brother. They moved on, a man and a dog, two ghosts bound by loyalty, pushing deeper into the heart of the storm. The smell hit them first, a metallic, chemical tang of rust and coal dust that cut through the earthy dampness of the forest. The trees began to thin, giving way to slag heaps and patches of scrub grass. Ahead, through the persistent gray fog, a shape began to resolve itself against the dark, flowing waters of the Allegheny River. It was a skeleton of rusted steel and broken corrugated panels, the long-abandoned Black Creek Breaker. Its towering structure was streaked with decay, its conveyors sagging like the bones of some great, dead beast. Ranger, despite his injuries, seemed to find a new surge of urgency. He pushed past Cade, his limp more pronounced on the rocky, uneven ground, and led him not to the main gate with its heavy, locked chain, but to a gap in the perimeter fence, half concealed by a thicket of overgrown sumac. Cade slipped through the opening, his pistol now in his hand, held low and ready. The air inside the fence was thick with the ghosts of industry. The faint smell of oil and metal, ground into the earth for a century. Ranger led him to a low, dark opening, a panel of rusted steel that had been pried open just enough for a person to squeeze through. The dog slipped inside without a pause. Cade followed, every muscle tense as his eyes adjusted to the cavernous darkness within. The inside of the coal breaker was a vast, echoing cathedral of decay. What little light filtered through the grime-caked windows far above revealed the hulking, skeletal shapes of sorting tables, chutes, and machinery, all draped in cobwebs and a thick coat of black dust. The sound of the river flowing past its foundations was a constant, powerful murmur. It was the perfect place to hide. And the perfect place to be cornered. Ranger stood waiting for him, his tail giving a single, low thump. His posture was no longer that of a guide, but of a sentry returning to his post. "Don't move." The voice was female, low and steady, but stretched thin with fear and exhaustion. It came from the shadows behind a massive, silent piece of machinery. Cade froze, his training taking over. He didn't turn his head. He listened, pinpointing the source, assessing the room's acoustics. He could hear a second set of smaller, shallower breaths from the same direction. A child. "I have a weapon," the voice warned. "I don't doubt it," Cade replied, his voice calm and even, designed to de-escalate. "Your dog found me. He's hurt bad." There was a pause. "Put your gun on the ground." Slowly. Cade weighed his options. The woman's position was defensive. Ranger was not reacting aggressively towards her, meaning she wasn't a threat to the dog. He was here for answers. A firefight would provide none. Slowly, deliberately, he knelt and placed his Sig Sauer on the grimy concrete floor, pushing it a few feet away. He rose with his hands open and visible. "It's done." A figure emerged from the shadows. She was a woman in her early 30s, with fierce, dark eyes that seemed to burn in the gloom. Her name, he would learn, was Isabel Rojas. She had high cheekbones and a cascade of tangled black hair that framed a face etched with worry but defined by an unbreakable strength. She was holding a length of rusted pipe, gripping it like a club, her knuckles white. Hiding behind her, clutching her worn jacket, was a small boy. He was maybe 8 years old, with his mother's dark eyes, but his were wide and vacant, as if he'd seen something no child should ever see. This was her son, Mateo. Isabel's gaze flickered from Cade to the dog, and her hard expression softened for a fraction of a second. "Ranger, you found him." Ranger limped to her, nuzzling his head against her leg. The gesture was all the confirmation Cade needed. These were the people he was meant to find. "He's bleeding," Isabel said, her attention snapping back to Cade. "Did you do this?" "No," Cade said simply. "Found him this way. Gunshot. I patched him up." Isabel's eyes narrowed, studying him, searching for deception. She found none. "Who are you?" This was it. The moment of truth. "My name is Cade Callahan." The name landed with physical force. The pipe in her hands lowered an inch. The tension in her shoulders eased almost imperceptibly. "He described you," she whispered, her voice cracking with the first hint of emotion. "He said you were tall, quiet, said you had eyes like a storm." Cade's heart hammered against his ribs. "He? Who?" "My husband," she said, her voice dropping, thick with a grief so fresh it was a raw wound. "He was a journalist. He was murdered 3 days ago." Cade felt a pang of sympathy, but it was drowned by a rising tide of confusion. "I'm sorry for your loss. But what does that have to do with me, or this dog?" Isabel took a shaky breath, her gaze locked on his. "Because before he died, he made me promise. He said if anything happened, I had to find you. He said you were the only one we could trust. The only one who would understand." She paused, letting the words hang in the cold, dusty air before delivering the final, world-shattering blow. His real name, the name he had before he had to disappear, was Ryan Fletcher. The name didn't just register, it detonated. Cade felt the solid concrete floor shift beneath him. The echoing sounds of the breaker faded to a dull roar in his ears. Ryan Fletcher, dead in a foreign valley, burned into his memory. The ghost that had stalked him for 7 years. "No," Cade heard himself say, the word a disbelieving rasp. "That's impossible. Ryan Fletcher is dead. I was there. He died on the objective." "He was left for dead," Isabel corrected, her voice sharp with the pain of an old, deep injustice. "He was wounded, taken in by local tribesmen who nursed him back to health. By the time he could make contact, the official story was already written. Task Force Aegis was gone. Ryan Fletcher was a name on a memorial wall. He was a ghost. Cade stared at her, then at the boy still clinging to her, watching him with those impossibly old eyes. Ryan's son. The thought was a seismic shock that rearranged the entire landscape of his life. He couldn't come back, Isabel continued, the story pouring out of her now in a torrent of grief and desperate explanation. Not officially. The same people who sent you into that ambush were still in power. A powerful man, a defense contractor named Julian Croft. His company, Valhalla Corp, supplied Aegis's intel, the intel that led you into a trap. Ryan figured it out. He realized the entire mission was a setup, designed to fail so Croft could profit from the fallout. She took a step closer, the pipe now forgotten at her side. So he became a ghost. He took my name, Rojas. He became an investigative journalist. And for 7 years, he dedicated his life to one thing, finding the proof to burn Julian Croft to the ground. He was close. So close. He had everything on that card. She pointed a trembling finger toward Cade's pocket. Croft found out. His men came for him. Ryan fought. He gave me and Mateo time to run. He told me to send Ranger for you. Cade looked down at the dog, now lying at Isabel's feet, his head on his paws, watching the man he had been sent to find. A messenger. A living, breathing link to a past Cade thought was buried forever. Everything he had believed, the crushing weight of his guilt, the very foundation of his 7-year exile, it was all a lie. Ryan hadn't died because of his mistake. He had survived, and he had been fighting a secret war. And now he was truly gone, murdered not by a foreign enemy, but by the same corruption they had sworn to fight. Why me? Cade finally managed to ask, his voice hollow. Isabel's dark eyes filled with tears, but they did not fall. Because, she said, her voice filled with the absolute conviction of a dying man's last words, he always said you were his brother. And he trusted you to finish the fight. The revelation of Ryan's true fate hung in the air, heavier than the coal dust dancing in the weak light. For a long moment, the only sounds were the rushing river outside and their own breathing. Cade felt like a man standing on the wreckage of his own life, the past 7 years a monument to a lie. He looked at Isabel, whose strength seemed to be held together by the thinnest of threads, and at the silent boy, Mateo, who was now watching him with an unnerving, analytical gaze. Croft, Cade said, his voice a low growl. He was testing the name, its weight. The CEO of Valhalla Corporation, he was feeding intel to Aegis. Isabel nodded, her dark eyes flashing with a cold fire. He fed you a lie. He pointed your team toward a non-existent target, right into a kill box. The ambush wasn't an accident. It was a corporate hit. One of the men in that village was a reporter who had proof Valhalla was selling restricted military hardware. Croft used the best soldiers in the world as his personal assassins, and he planned to have you all eliminated to bury the evidence. The pieces slammed into place with sickening clarity. The bad intel, the perfectly positioned enemy, the accidental comms failure. It was all a setup. Ryan survived, Cade stated, the words still feeling unreal. And he never stopped fighting, Isabel said. She moved to a small, makeshift camp they had set up in a rusted-out control room, a space with a desk and a single chair. She picked up a worn, leather-bound journal, Ryan's. When he couldn't expose Croft for what happened overseas, because officially, none of you were ever there, he started digging into his domestic operations. That's what led him here, to Pennsylvania. She gestured vaguely toward the distant city. Croft is using Valhalla's resources to force through a massive fracking project. It requires seizing protected state lands, trampling on local property rights. Ryan found a pattern. Every community organizer, every local politician, every landowner who stood in Croft's way either vanished or died in a convenient accident. She finally looked at Mateo, her expression softening into one of profound pain. My husband was helping a group of landowners build a legal case. He gathered everything: financial records, shell corporations, sworn testimonies. He recorded a meeting where Croft's top lieutenant gave the order to silence a farmer who wouldn't sell his land. It's all on that card. As if on cue, a new sound cut through the murmur of the river. It was the low, throaty rumble of an engine, growing steadily closer, and then suddenly cutting out. Silence. Every muscle in Cade's body went rigid. Ranger, who had been resting, was instantly on his feet, his ears pricked forward, a low, guttural growl vibrating deep in his chest. Get down, Cade commanded, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. He grabbed Isabel and pulled her and Mateo behind the solid steel base of a massive, defunct rock crusher. He crept to a grimy window, a long shard of glass missing from one corner, and peered out. A sleek, black SUV was parked on the access road. 4 men were getting out. They were dressed in dark, functional civilian clothing, but they moved with the coordinated, disciplined purpose of a trained team. They fanned out, securing the area, their movements economical and precise. A 5th man got out last. He was different, taller than the others, with a lean, predatory build. Even from a distance, Cade could see he moved with a chilling calm, his eyes methodically scanning the decaying structure. The leader. He held no visible weapon, yet he was undeniably the most dangerous man there. This, Cade knew instinctively, was Stark, a man who hunted people for a living, his face a mask of cold professionalism with pale, watchful eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Stark raised a hand, making a series of silent gestures. His team split up, 2 moving to circle the building's perimeter, 2 advancing directly toward the main entrance. They were professionals. They were here to kill them, and they were going to do it efficiently. They found us, Isabel breathed, her voice tight with terror. Mateo didn't make a sound, but he buried his face in his mother's side, his small body trembling. Stay here. Don't move. Don't make a sound, Cade ordered. His mind was already a whirlwind of tactical calculations. 4 hostiles plus the leader. 1 primary entrance. Multiple other openings. The main floor was a kill zone. They needed cover, hard cover. He scanned the cavernous space. The breaker was a maze of rusted metal, a tactical playground if you knew how to use it. He pointed toward a network of catwalks and narrow maintenance corridors on the far side of the building. We need to move. Over there. Now. The sound of a heavy bolt cutter snapping through the lock on the main door echoed through the building like a gunshot. There was no more time. Cade grabbed Isabel's arm, urging her forward. They moved in a low crouch, darting between hulking pieces of machinery, Ranger moving silently beside them, his limp forgotten in the surge of adrenaline. They reached the base of a rusted metal staircase leading up to the catwalks. You and Mateo, get up there. Find a place to hide at the far end, behind those old conveyor belts, Cade whispered urgently. Stay down until I come for you. Isabel hesitated, her eyes wide with fear. What are you going to do? What Ryan sent me here to do, he said, his gaze hard as steel. I'm going to finish the fight. He gave her a gentle push. Go. Now. She didn't argue. She scooped Mateo into her arms and scrambled up the stairs, disappearing into the shadows above. Cade turned back to face the entrance. He could hear their voices now, low and professional. 2 targets, plus the asset, a voice said. It was Stark's, calm and devoid of emotion. The woman and the boy are expendable. The primary objective is the K9 and whatever it's carrying. Search pattern alpha. No collateral. No witnesses. Cade melted into the shadows beneath the catwalk, his pistol held in a 2-handed grip, the weapon an extension of his will. He was 1 man against 5. The odds were impossible. But in the rusted, decaying labyrinth of the Black Creek Breaker, with the ghost of his brother watching over him, he was finally back on familiar ground. He saw the first man step through the doorway, a dark silhouette against the gray light, rifle held at the ready. Cade centered his sights on the man's chest. He let out a slow, steady breath. The silence was shattered by the sharp, deafening crack of his P226. The first shot was fired. The coal breaker had just become a war zone. The gunshot echoed in the vast metallic space, a sound of brutal finality. The man in the doorway crumpled, not with a cry, but with a heavy, boneless thud. Before the body hit the ground, Cade was already moving. He didn't run, he flowed, moving through the decaying labyrinth like a ghost in his own element, the years of training a muscle memory that transcended thought. Every shadow was cover. Every piece of rusted machinery was a potential tool. The remaining 3 mercenaries outside responded instantly, laying down disciplined bursts of suppressive fire, bullets sparking off steel and punching holes in the corrugated walls. Cade ignored them. He was already 50 feet away. Using the noise as cover, he grabbed a heavy, rusted gear from a defunct conveyor and hurled it into a pile of loose sheet metal on the far side of the building. The resulting crash was deafening. Keller, flank left. He's over by the sorting tables. Stark's voice, cold and controlled, cut through the din. The feint worked. 2 of the mercenaries moved to cover their teammate as he advanced on the noise. It was the opening Cade needed. He didn't engage. He retreated, melting back into the deeper shadows beneath the catwalks, circling toward the staircase where Isabel and Mateo were hidden. Survival was about controlling the engagement. His priority wasn't elimination. It was protection. He reached the base of the stairs and ascended, his steps making no sound on the groaning metal. He found Isabel and Matteo huddled behind a stack of rotting wooden pallets, just as he'd told them. Isabel held her son tight, her body shielding his, but her eyes were scanning the factory floor, alert and defiant. "Are you okay?" he whispered. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Matteo was trembling, but his wide, dark eyes were fixed on Cade, not with terror, but with a strange, intense focus. The firing below stopped. It was replaced by a tense, waiting silence that was somehow more menacing. They were regrouping. Hunting. "They're professionals," Cade breathed, his gaze sweeping the floor below, tracking the subtle shifts of shadow that betrayed movement. "They won't just charge. They'll sweep section by section." They were trapped, pinned down on the exposed catwalk with limited cover and nowhere to go. In the sudden, oppressive quiet, with death potentially seconds away, Isabel spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "He talked about you, you know," she said, her words seeming to come from another world. Cade didn't take his eyes off the floor below. "Who? Ryan?" "All the time," she confirmed. "Especially when things got hard. He kept a journal." She patted the worn leather book she still clutched. "He wrote about that day, in the valley." Cade's jaw tightened. "There's nothing to say, I followed orders. I left him behind." The words were acid, the confession he had recited to himself in the dark for 7 years. "No," Isabel said, her voice fierce, cutting through his self-recrimination. "That's not what he wrote. He wrote that you followed orders because you were the best operator he ever knew, and you understood that getting the rest of the team out was the only call to make. He wrote that he was proud of you for it." Cade flinched as if struck. He finally turned to look at her, his stormy eyes clouded with a disbelief so profound it was painful. "He never blamed you, Cade," she said, her own eyes filling with tears. "Not for a second. His fight with Croft, it wasn't for revenge. It was for the whole team. For the honor of Aegis. He was just finishing the mission you all started." The words struck the core of Cade's being, shattering the guilt-ridden foundation of his life. For 7 years, he had been haunted by the ghost of a man who needed avenging. But the truth was, Ryan's ghost had never been chasing him. It had been trying to set him free. The weight on his soul didn't vanish, but it shifted, transformed from a burden of failure into a mantle of responsibility. He wasn't just protecting a widow and her child. He was finishing his brother's last mission. "Team moving." A voice crackled from below. Stark's men were advancing. One of them, a thick-set man named Keller, was now at the base of their staircase. They were out of time. Cade raised his pistol, preparing for the inevitable. They were compromised. Then a small hand tugged on his sleeve. He looked down. Matteo was staring up at him, his face pale but his expression resolute. The boy's trembling had stopped. He pointed not toward an escape route, but at a section of the rusted wall beside them. It looked like nothing, just another piece of decaying breaker. But he pointed with an insistence that was impossible to ignore. He tugged Cade's sleeve again, his eyes pleading. Cade frowned, confused. "What is it, Matteo?" Matteo didn't speak. He couldn't. But he could act. He reached out and tapped a specific spot on the wall, a place where a small square maintenance hatch had been bolted shut and painted over decades ago. The edges were almost invisible under layers of rust and grime. Suddenly, Cade understood. A hiding place. A dead drop. "Isabel, the card," he said urgently. "The one I have. Is it the only one?" Isabel looked from Matteo to the panel, comprehension dawning on her face. Ryan was paranoid. He was brilliant. He always had a backup. A decoy. Of course. The card in Cade's pocket was a decoy, meant to be found. A breadcrumb to lead Croft's men here. But the real evidence was hidden. Ryan had been playing chess, and this was his final move. Keller was starting up the stairs, his movement slow and methodical. "Work on those bolts. Fast." Cade handed his combat knife to Isabel. While Isabel frantically scraped at the rusted bolts, Cade turned his attention back to the threat. He needed to buy them seconds. He saw another mercenary moving into the open below. Without hesitation, Cade fired 2 rounds, not at the man, but at a heavy chain hoist suspended precariously above him. One bullet sparked off the chain. The second shattered the rusted release mechanism. With a deafening screech of tortured metal, the massive iron hook and pulley plunged downwards, crashing onto the concrete floor a mere 5 feet from the mercenary, who scrambled back with a curse. The distraction worked. Behind him, Cade heard a final groaning pop as Isabel wrenched the panel free. Inside the small, dark cavity was a single object wrapped in oilskin. Another memory card. The real one. Isabel pressed it into his hand. Her touch was firm, a transfer of trust, of hope. Finish it, Cade, she whispered. For him. Cade pocketed the card. He looked at Mateo, who was watching him, a flicker of his father's fierce determination in his young eyes. The boy had saved them. He had completed his father's last move. Cade turned back to the advancing mercenaries, the weight of the real objective now settled in his pocket. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, he knew exactly what he was fighting for. The crash of the chain hoist bought them seconds, not minutes. Below, Cade could hear Stark's voice, sharp and angry. Keller, status. Martinez, hold position. He's trying to draw us in. They were adapting, smart and dangerous. Keller, the mercenary on the stairs, had recovered and was advancing again, his rifle raised, a dark silhouette of impending death. There's no way out, Isabel breathed, her back pressed against the rusted wall. Cade didn't answer. His mind was a machine processing angles and options. He looked down the long, exposed catwalk. A shooting gallery. A death sentence. Then his eyes fell on what was next to them, a wide, steeply angled metal chute, slick with decades of coal dust and grime, that dropped into the darkness of the main factory floor. An old coal slide. A fast, ugly, and entirely unpredictable way down. It was their only chance. When I move, you follow. Don't hesitate, he ordered. He waited, letting Keller take 2 more steps up the stairs, drawing him further from his team's support. Then Cade exploded into motion. He didn't fire. He launched himself forward, kicking a loose metal grate on the catwalk floor. The grate flew down the catwalk, another sound faint. As Keller's head instinctively turned toward the noise, Cade charged. He met the mercenary on the stairs not with a bullet, but with the full, brutal force of his body. It was a collision. Cade's shoulder slammed into Keller's chest, the impact knocking the air from his lungs. The mercenary stumbled backward, his rifle flying from his hands, and tumbled down the metal stairs with a series of sickening, bone-jarring crashes. Go! Cade yelled, not waiting to see the outcome. He grabbed Isabel's arm, pulling her and a terrified Mateo toward the chute. Don't think, just slide. Isabel didn't hesitate. She sat, pulled Mateo into her lap, and pushed off, disappearing into the grimy darkness with a sharp gasp. Ranger, loyal to the last, leapt in after them. Cade followed a second later, the world becoming a terrifying, scraping rush of rusted metal and shadow. He landed hard on a pile of discarded conveyor belts, the impact jarring his bones. He was on his feet in an instant, his pistol up. Isabel was already helping a shaken Mateo to his feet. Ranger was there, growling low, a dark protector standing over them. Above, he could hear Stark shouting orders, the hunt renewed with a furious intensity. This way, Isabel urged. She led them away from the main floor into the foundation of the breaker, a labyrinth of thick concrete pillars and dripping pipes. The air grew thick and cold, heavy with the smell of damp earth and decay. She stopped before a section of the wall that looked no different from the rest, then pushed against a large, algae-covered stone. With a low groan of protest, a heavy, rusted iron door swung inwards, revealing a dark, narrow passage. A smuggling tunnel, a relic from the past. Ryan's foresight had been their salvation. They scrambled inside, and Cade heaved the heavy door shut, plunging them into absolute darkness. The sounds of the hunt were instantly muffled, replaced by their own ragged breathing and the slow, rhythmic drip of water. Cade pulled a small tactical flashlight from his pocket, its beam cutting a clean white line through the black. They were in a narrow, brick-lined tunnel. The air was earthy, and he could feel a slight breeze. It had an exit. For the first time since the SUV arrived, they were in a place of relative safety. Now talk, Cade said. What's the full plan? Ryan was too smart to have survive as his only strategy. Isabel leaned against the damp wall. He was, she agreed. He knew Croft was untouchable through legal means alone. His lawyers, his connections, he was a ghost in the system. Ryan needed to force him into the light. She looked at Cade, her eyes intense in the flashlight's beam. 2 weeks ago, Ryan sent a package to a contact, a trusted agent inside the FBI's Pittsburgh field office. Her name is Eva Rustova. Cade recognized the name. Rustova was a legend. By the book, relentless, and immune to political pressure. Exactly the kind of person Ryan would trust. The package contained partial data, Isabel continued. Enough to open an investigation, but not enough for a warrant against a man like Croft. It was an insurance policy. Rustova had instructions. If she didn't hear from Ryan by a specific deadline, which was yesterday, She was to assume the worst. But she still couldn't move without probable cause. They needed Croft's people to commit an overt, violent act on U.S. soil. Something undeniable. The pieces fell into place, forming a picture of a brilliant, desperate gambit. This, Cade said, gesturing back toward the breaker. This is the overt act. Yes, Isabel confirmed. The siege, the hunt, an armed assault against American citizens. That's the trigger. Ryan's plan was to lure them into a trap where they couldn't deny what they were. Rest of his team is probably on their way, but the plan only worked if we survived long enough for them to get here. A heavy silence fell between them. Cade finally understood his role. He was the guardian, the shield, the one variable Ryan had counted on to keep his family alive against impossible odds. He didn't send you here to fight his war, Isabel said softly. He sent you here to make sure we survived long enough for his plan to work. Your mission was to get us out. An escape. That's all it was meant to be. He could follow this tunnel to its end. He could take Isabel and Mateo, disappear, and let the FBI handle the rest. He could go back to his cabin, back to his solitude, back to his ghosts. But as he stood there in the dark, he knew he couldn't. Running away would just be another form of hiding. For 7 years, he had run from the ghost of Ryan Fletcher. Now he had a chance to stand and fight alongside him, to finish the last chapter of his story, to make the sacrifice of Task Force Aegis mean something. The choice was never really a choice at all. You and Mateo need to keep moving, he said, his voice resonating with a newfound, unshakable resolve. This tunnel will likely lead out to the woods north of here. Get as far away as you can and wait. He handed her his small, military-grade satellite phone. This is set to an emergency channel. Turn it on when you're clear. The FBI will be monitoring it. Tell Agent Rustova everything. Isabel stared at him, her eyes wide. What are you going to do? You're not coming with us. Ryan's plan needs a trigger, Cade replied, his gaze locked on the darkness of the tunnel behind them. And those men aren't going to just give up. They're going to keep hunting. I need to make sure they're still here when the cavalry arrives. He was choosing to be the bait. He turned to the boy, who had been silent through it all, and knelt down. Your father was the bravest man I ever knew, Mateo. Be strong for your mom. Then he looked at Ranger, who seemed to understand everything. The dog whined, nudging his head against Cade's hand. Protect them, Cade ordered softly. He gave Isabel one last, final look, a look of shared purpose, a silent promise to the memory of the man they both loved. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back into the darkness of the tunnel, back toward the sounds of the fight, leaving the hope of escape behind him. He was no longer running from his past. He was running toward it. The darkness of the tunnel was a temporary reprieve, but Cade did not stay in it long. Every step back toward the coal breaker was a step away from the man who had hidden in the mountains. He was no longer a ghost running from the past. He was a wraith, returning to haunt those who had wronged him. He emerged back into the vast, echoing foundation of the building, the air tasting of rust and cordite. Above, he could hear the methodical clanking of Stark's men sweeping the catwalks. They would soon realize their quarry had vanished. He didn't have much time. Cade's mission was simple, brutal, and likely fatal. He had to be loud. He had to be a significant enough threat that Stark and his team couldn't possibly leave. He had to pin them down until Ryan's plan could come to fruition. He moved silently along the periphery of the main floor, his senses on fire. He found what he was looking for, a maintenance ladder leading up to a small, enclosed control booth that overlooked the entire factory floor. It was a perfect sniper's nest. From here, he could see them before they saw him. He climbed, settling into the cramped, dusty space. Through the grimy window, he saw them. 3 of them, moving along the catwalks on the far side. Stark was on the main floor, directing them with sharp, silent hand signals. They were converging on the coal chute. Cade raised his pistol, his breathing slow and even, his heartbeat a steady drum. He wasn't aiming to kill. Not yet. He was aiming to create chaos. He centered his sights on a heavy, rusted electrical conduit running along the wall just above the mercenaries' heads. He fired once. The bullet ricocheted off the metal with a high-pitched scream, showering the men below with sparks and rust. They reacted instantly, dropping into cover, their rifles scanning for his position. He's still here. One of them shouted. East side, high ground. Martinez, suppress. Stark commanded from below. Russo, with me. We're flushing him out. Cade fired again, this time hitting a junction box which erupted in a shower of blue and white sparks, plunging half of the breaker into deeper shadow. He had their attention. Now he had to keep them guessing. He slipped out of the control booth before they could pinpoint his exact location and dropped back down to the main floor, using the newly created darkness as his shield. The hunt was now a two-way street. For the next 20 minutes, the breaker became a deadly game of cat and mouse. Cade was a phantom. He used the decaying environment to his advantage, creating diversions, taking single, harassing shots from unexpected angles, then melting back into the shadows before they could retaliate. He was a master of his craft, turning their superior numbers and firepower into a disadvantage in the cluttered, confusing terrain. Stark was no fool. He quickly realized he wasn't dealing with a panicked journalist, he was dealing with a professional, someone with skills that rivaled or even surpassed his own. Frustration began to creep into his commands. He's playing with us. Box him in. Cut off the exits. The net began to tighten. The mercenaries, though frustrated, were still a disciplined unit. They stopped reacting to his feints and began a slow, methodical sweep, clearing the area inch by inch. Cade found himself being herded, his options dwindling. He was pushed back into a corner of the factory, a dead end where old machinery was piled high like a rusty barricade. He slid behind a massive, defunct boiler, its cold steel providing solid cover. He had 2 magazines left. They knew where he was. The game was over. The final stand was here. He could hear their boots on the concrete, methodical, closing in. Nowhere left to run, Stark's voice called out, calm and final. You're good. I'll give you that. But you're alone, and you're out of time. Cade checked the magazine in his pistol. 5 rounds left. He took a deep breath. He thought of Ryan. He thought of Isabel and Mateo, hopefully clear of the tunnel by now. He had bought them the time. That was all that mattered. Stark and his 2 remaining men appeared at the end of the corridor of machinery, their weapons pointed directly at his position. Come on out, Stark said. We can make this quick. Cade raised his pistol, ready to sell his life for a few more seconds. Then a new sound broke the standoff. It started as a low, deep thumping, a vibration felt more than heard, that grew rapidly into the unmistakable, percussive roar of helicopter rotors. It wasn't one helicopter. It was several, descending fast. Suddenly, the entire breaker was bathed in the blinding white light of searchlights. A voice, amplified by a bullhorn, boomed from the heavens, shaking the very walls of the building. Federal agents. This is the FBI. Drop your weapons. You are surrounded. For the first time, Cade saw a flicker of something other than cold confidence on Stark's face. Shock. Pure, unadulterated shock. Before he could react, the high windows of the breaker shattered inwards as flashbang grenades detonated, filling the space with a blinding flash and a deafening boom. Agents in dark tactical gear swarmed in from every entrance, ropes dropping from the ceiling, their movements a wave of disciplined force that overwhelmed Stark's men in seconds. The raid was swift, brutal, and beautiful in its efficiency. Directing the controlled chaos was a woman in a dark blue FBI windbreaker. She moved with a calm, focused authority, her sharp eyes missing nothing. This was Agent Eva Rustova, a woman carved from purpose, her expression a mask of grim determination. Ryan's contact had arrived. In the disorienting aftermath of the flashbangs, one of Stark's men, Martinez, recovered faster than the others. Dazed but desperate, he raised his rifle, swinging it toward the nearest clear target, Agent Rustova. He never fired. A black and tan blur, a furious streak of loyalty and rage, erupted from the shadows of the loading bay. It was Ranger. He hadn't followed Isabel and Mateo out of the tunnel. He had come back for Cade. The dog hit Martinez with the force of a freight train, 110 pounds of muscle and teeth slamming into the mercenary's chest. The rifle flew from his hands as he crashed to the ground, the dog's deep, protective snarls the only sound he heard before agents were on top of him. Stark stood frozen amidst the chaos, his weapon on the floor, his hand slowly rising in the air. His cold, professional mask was gone, replaced by the bitter, furious expression of a man who had been completely and utterly outplayed. Agent Rustova approached Cade, her sidearm holstered, her eyes assessing him. Cade Callahan? Cade nodded, his body finally allowing the exhaustion to seep in. Agent Rustova. He reached into his pocket, his hand closing around the small, precious piece of plastic that had started it all. He pulled out the real memory card. I believe this belongs to you, he said, holding it out to her. It's from Ryan. Rustova took it, her expression unreadable but for a flicker of respect in her eyes. The plan worked, she said simply. Cade looked past her to where an agent was calming a still bristling Ranger. The dog met his gaze, his tail giving a single, exhausted thump against the concrete. He had come back. The battle for the breaker was over. The world outside the coal breaker was a symphony of flashing blue and red lights against the pre-dawn gloom. The fog had started to lift, leaving the air clean and cold. Cade sat on the bumper of an FBI vehicle, a coarse blanket draped over his shoulders, watching as the last of Stark's men were led away in cuffs. Ranger sat faithfully at his feet, his head resting on Cade's knee, a silent, furry anchor in the swirling chaos. Agent Rustova approached, her face grim but with an undercurrent of triumph. "The data on that card is already being decrypted," she said. "Coupled with the armed assault, we have everything we need. A federal judge just signed the warrant. We're going to get him." There was no need to ask who him was. The sun was just beginning to cast a pale, watery light over the Pittsburgh skyline as the FBI convoy, with Cade in tow, ascended to the top floor of the city's most prestigious skyscraper. The offices of Valhalla Corp were a world away from the rust and decay of the breaker. It was a space of cold glass, polished steel, and sweeping panoramic views. A sterile temple built on a foundation of secrets and blood. They found Julian Croft standing by his floor-to-ceiling window, looking down on the city as if he owned it. He was a man in his late 50s, immaculately dressed in a tailored suit, with silver hair swept back from a patrician forehead. He had the smooth, confident face of a man who had never been told no, and his eyes, a pale, chilly blue, held a placid arrogance that was utterly unnerving. He turned as they entered, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. "Agent Rustova," he said, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone. "To what do I owe the pleasure of this early morning visit? If this is about the Appalachian drilling project, I assure you my permits are all in order." Rustova didn't waste time. She held up the arrest warrant. "Julian Croft, you are under arrest for conspiracy, racketeering, and on suspicion of ordering the murders of Ryan Fletcher and 17 other American citizens." Croft's smile didn't falter, but his eyes hardened, the placid blue turning to chips of ice. "That's a rather spectacular accusation. You have no proof." "We have your men, captured in the act of trying to murder a woman and her child," Rustova stated flatly. "And we have this." She held up a small evidence bag containing the memory card. "Ryan Fletcher's last testament." Croft's composure finally cracked. For a fraction of a second, a flicker of raw fury crossed his face before being replaced by his mask of cool indifference. He straightened his tie. "You'll find my lawyers are far more persuasive than a dead journalist's fantasies." As two agents moved forward to cuff him, Croft's icy gaze settled on Cade, who had been standing silently by the door. "You," he sneered. "The ghost. The one that got away. You should have stayed dead." Cade said nothing. He simply met the man's gaze, his own eyes a stormy sea of judgment. For the first time, Julian Croft looked away. The atmosphere in the FBI field office was a controlled hum of activity. Cade, Isabel, and Mateo were in a quiet debriefing room. Ranger was curled up under the table, sleeping the sleep of the exhausted and the victorious. Isabel had just finished giving her official statement to Rustova. "We have enough to put him away for a very long time," Rustova said, closing her notebook. "The financial data alone is damning, but his lawyers will try to muddy the waters, claim it was all Stark acting as a rogue agent." She sighed. "We need something personal, something that ties Croft directly to the order to kill Ryan." As she spoke, the door opened and Julian Croft was led past the room's observation window, flanked by agents, on his way to an interrogation cell. Mateo, who had been sitting quietly staring at the table, suddenly stood up. His small body was rigid, his eyes locked on Croft's passing figure. He walked to the window, pressing his small hands against the glass. Isabel started to go to him. "Mateo, honey, it's okay." But Cade put a gentle hand on her arm, stopping her. "Wait." Mateo watched Croft until he disappeared from view, then he turned around. He looked at his mother, at Agent Rustova, and finally his gaze settled on Cade. He took a deep, shuddering breath, his small chest heaving with the effort. And then, for the first time since he had seen his father die, he spoke. His voice was small, hoarse from disuse, but in the silent room, it was as loud as a thunderclap. "He was there," Mateo said, his words clear and precise. He raised a small, trembling finger and pointed toward the empty hallway where Croft had just been. "That man, he was the one who gave the order." The room was frozen in a moment of stunned silence. Isabel let out a soft, choked sob, covering her mouth with her hand. Mateo looked at his mother, and then back at Cade, a flood of words now pouring out of him. "Daddy told him to leave us alone, but that man was quiet." Then he looked at the other man, the one with the cold eyes, and he said, "Fix the problem." Just like that, the final piece, the undeniable link, a child's memory, pure and incorruptible, had just sealed a powerful man's fate. It was a miracle born of trauma and courage. Later, after the statements were taken, Agent Rustova approached Cade alone. "There's something else," she said, holding out a sealed, waterproof envelope. "It was in the package Ryan sent me. He had specific instructions. This was only to be given to you." Cade took the envelope. It felt heavy in his hands, heavy with the weight of 7 years. He opened it. Inside was a single handwritten letter. The handwriting was Ryan's, familiar and yet achingly foreign. "Cade. If you're reading this, it means 2 things. 1, I didn't make it. And 2, my plan worked. It means the best damn SEAL I ever knew came through for me one last time. Don't let anyone, especially yourself, tell you that you failed me in that valley. You made the right call. The only call. You saved our team. I was just the cost of doing business that day, brother. It was never your fault. I need you to know that. My only regret is that I never got to tell you I survived. But coming back would have put you all in danger. Croft had eyes everywhere. So I fought him from the shadows. If I failed, then that fight falls to you. Protect Isabel and Mateo. They're your family now, too. Show my son what it means to be a good man. Don't hide in the mountains forever. Don't let the ghosts win. Live for me. For all the brothers we lost. Your life is your own again. Go make it a good one. Your brother. Rye." Cade read the letter twice, the words blurring through the tears he didn't realize he was shedding. The weight he had carried for so long, the shrapnel in his soul, finally dissolved, washed away by the forgiveness of a ghost. He found Isabel and Mateo by the entrance of the building, waiting for him. The sun was fully up now, casting long shadows across the city. Ranger stood beside them, a loyal sentinel. Isabel looked at him, her eyes asking a question she didn't need to speak. Cade looked at the mountains in the distance, then back at them. The woman who had lost everything but her will to fight. The boy who had found his voice in the face of true evil. He had gone into the wilderness to die. But Ryan had sent a messenger to pull him back into the world of the living. "Ryan's farm will need someone to run it," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "Keep it safe for Mateo." Isabel offered him a small, watery smile. "Is that an answer to a question I didn't ask?" For the first time in 7 years, a genuine smile touched Cade Callahan's lips. "I spent 7 years hiding from ghosts," he said. "I think it's time I tried building something new. If you'll have me." Mateo, brave and no longer silent, stepped forward and took Cade's hand. "Ranger brought you to us for a reason," he said, his voice now confident. "Papa said you'd protect us. You did." Cade squeezed his hand, looking from the boy to his mother. 3 broken people, a loyal dog, and the memory of a hero. Together, they might just be whole. They walked out of the building and into the morning sun. A new family, stepping into the first day of their new dawn.